Good evening, everybody. I'm Mary Beth Coggins. I work at Phoenixville Hospital, and I'm a social worker. We have a very small department up at the hospital, but we like to think we call ourselves small but mighty, and we like to think that we help people, as best as we can. Tonight, I've been asked to talk about family violence, which used to be called domestic violence. And our families have changed over the generations. What our families look like have changed, and so domestic or family violence is much more than simply a man and a woman fighting. Okay, it can be anything. It incorporates partner violence. It incorporates elder abuse. It can incorporate child abuse. It can be a whole lot of things. But I'm going to talk a little bit about intimate partner violence. I'm going to talk a little bit about elder abuse and a little bit about child abuse. Okay? And if I don't touch on something that you want to talk about, just speak up. Okay? Intimate partner abuse, which used to be called domestic violence. Nowadays, even though families have changed, it's still very much women in the statistics that are being abused. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I personally don't think it's because men are not abused. I believe that men don't come forward when they're abused, but you'd be surprised how many men come to me in the hospital when they're going through a procedure, they're feeling safe, they're in the hospital, their girlfriend or wife is in another room, and say, I'm being abused and I need help. So I think that there are more men today than ever before, but the statistics show that it's still women that are predominantly abused today. The cycle of abuse, people think that generally that people who drink or use drugs would be abusive or more abusive than usual, but again, the research shows that it's an abusive person is probably someone that grew up with abuse and was taught that that's the way you cope with things. If you don't like what your child says or what your child does, you beat them. And so when they grow up, the children, that's how they've learned to cope with life, and so they're generally the abusers. It's learned behavior. Now, you can also have involved with that mental illness, and on top of that, alcohol. But the alcohol doesn't cause the abuse. It may make you, as an abuser, freer to be abusive, but the alcohol doesn't cause the abuse. And mental health doesn't cause the abuse. It's a learned behavior. So it happens quite frequently, more frequently than you would imagine. And again, we have a lot of women that come in the hospital. Generally, unless they come into the ER because they've been hurt and they're injured and they want to be seen by a doctor, usually we find out when they come into the hospital for something else. And we have questions on our evaluations that the nurses ask. Have you ever been hurt by someone? Have you been hurt with someone in the last few days, in the last year? Would you like some help? Do you feel unsafe? Are you scared to go back home? Those are the kind of questions. If any of those come up, yes, then they call social service and we talk with that person. If it's a woman who's in a marriage and has children, for example, and she wants to get out, generally there's a lot of resources out there right now. Every county has a domestic violence center program, which includes a hotline. It's not just social workers being supportive, although that's valuable. It's also people who know how to counsel women that have been abused, and they're tough. And what I mean by that is women at that point don't always want to hear nice, oh, it's a shame, although that helps. They want to hear it's time to tighten your belt buckle and get some help. It's time to call the police. It's time to move out, and we're going to help you to do that, and we're going to tell you how to do that. And that's really what they do. So when I am talking to someone who's being abused in a marital or couples relationship, I work very hard to get them on the phone on that hotline with those counselors, because once they talk to those counselors, they seem to be empowered. Whatever they say to them, they're empowered, they're strong, they're ready to go. It's very scary if you're being beaten up by somebody and you've been beaten up for a long time and that person's telling you that you're useless, that you deserve it, that you're stupid. It's very scary to walk away from him and walk out of that house because in your mind you already have a fear of him. You're going to be scared to walk past him. Is he going to reach out? I mean, literally, if you think, like if you picture walking past that person to get to the door and he's between the door, what's he going to do to you when you walk past him? I mean, it's that frightening. And then once you leave, they say it's the most dangerous time because that's when they come to try to find you. That's when they're in a rage because you left. How dare you? Abusive men will keep women isolated. They usually don't allow them to work. If they do work, they show up at their job and try to get them fired. They try to keep them isolated because they don't want other people to know that they're abusing them. So they'll keep tight reins on their money so they can't leave. Maybe they hold the keys to the car. Maybe they keep the car low on gas. So it's a very, very scary thing. We have several nurses in the hospital that have come forward because they're being abused. We had one nurse that, actually I was in the car leaving one night, and I didn't know this nurse. It was summer, the windows were down, and behind me I could hear some man screaming at the top of his lungs at someone, and I was frightened hearing him scream. It wasn't just somebody yelling it. I was frightened. So I turned around and I realized it was one of the nurses that I work with every day. And it's none of my business, right? But I made it my business. The next day, I went in, I found her, I sat down beside her, and I said, you know, this is none of my business, but no one deserves to be treated like that. And she didn't know me. She looked at me, and she just started crying, and she had to leave and go into another room so she could, you know, cry. And then she came back, and she said that last night, the night that I heard her when they went home, he had taken her, she was a little thing, he picked her up, walked to the top of the steps, and threw her down the steps. She was black and blue from here to here, where you couldn't see it. I had to really encourage her to go down to the emergency room, that I would go with her, and I took pictures of all of the black and blue marks, and she was able to then bring my cell phone, because I'm too stupid to know how to get those pictures off the phone. I gave her my cell phone. She brought them to the police, and the police department got all the pictures off, and that gentleman is now in jail now. But that had been going on for years with her, and she just didn't have the courage. She was too scared of him, because if he's going to throw her down the steps, if she tries to leave, what's going to happen if he finds her? He's going to do a lot more than throw her down the steps. I mean, in her mind, that's what she was thinking. So anyway, that's just one story, and a lot of times it happens right next door to you and you don't even know it. So just some facts that I hope you don't mind I'm going to read to you. I don't have them all in my head. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women between the ages of 15 and 44 in the United States, and that's higher than car accidents and rapes combined. There are only 1,500 shelters for battered women in the United States. There are 3,800 animal shelters. 3 to 4 billion women in the United States are beaten in their homes each year by husbands, ex-husbands, or male lovers. And that's from Women in Violence, which were hearings before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee August 29th and December 11th, 1990. One woman is beaten by her husband or partner every 15 seconds in the United States. And I could go on and on and on. 85% of domestic violence victims are women. Police report that between 40% and 60% of the calls they receive, especially on the night shift, are domestic violence disputes. Oh, this one was interesting. Police are more likely to respond within 5 minutes if an abuser is a stranger rather than an abuser who's known to the female victim that called, because they naturally feel that, I don't know what they think, the woman asked for it, I don't know what they think, but they don't generally respond. It's rarely an isolated event, so I always tell people this won't be the last time. If you don't do something, it won't be the last time, and it never is. 25% to 45% of all women who are battered during pregnancy. It's their fault they're pregnant. I've heard that. Boys who witness domestic violence in their families when they're growing up are twice as likely to abuse their own partners and children when they become adults. The average prison sentence of men who kill their women partners in an abuse dispute is 2 to 6 years, but women who kill their male partners are on an average sentenced to 15 years. That's enough gruesome details. But it is a big problem, and I see it every day in the hospital. It has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with socioeconomic background. I've had women come into Phoenixville Hospital from the main line. Why do they come up here? Nobody knows them up here. Dressed to the teeth, Cadillacs in the parking lot, and some have said to me, they tell me their story, and then they say I would leave if I had any gas money for my car. But the good side of all of it is that, we're trying to educate people more. We're trying to work with children on the end of child abuse to educate them, to help those that have grown up with violence, and hopefully we'll start to see some differences in those statistics. I sure hope so. A lot of times with women and men, we teach them to make a safety plan. So if someone's being abused, they have to make a safety plan for at home if something happens, if they're at work if something happens, if they're in public and something happens. It sounds silly, but let me see if I have that with me here. Yeah, here it is. And it's not just at home that it happens. If a woman has a job, a gentleman will show up at her work, try to get her fired, make a scene at work. She has to choose whether to tell her boss, is she going to get fired? And there's like 10 pages here of a safety plan that we can help women to make to get out the door, which includes, packing a bag, keeping it at a friend's house, keeping it at a family member's house. Make sure, you have to make sure if you have children, take their birth certificates, school records, immunization records, pack enough clothes. They can literally take their children and go to a safe house, they call them. It's not a shelter, it's a safe house that's run by the domestic violence people in each county. And no one knows where that is. I don't even know where they are. I call a number, they say hello. And because I know who they are, I'll tell them what I need. But nobody else would necessarily know that's a safe house. And women can stay there up to, I don't know what the current numbers are, but they can stay there up to 30 days. And so if they go and the staff feel that they're going to be leaving to go home again out of fear, they encourage them to go home now, because you may need those whole 30 days at some time when you really want to leave, when you really have the courage to leave. So it's very sad. But they're leaving, they're taking their children, they have to take everything with them that the kids need, because the kids have to go to school and get dressed and eat. So it's very, very tough. St. Mary's here in town is a women's shelter, women and families, but they have been known to take domestic violence families. There's a huge place in Westchester, in Norristown. There's a facility called Laurel House, and there are others, many others. So people that are abused, people that you know, yourselves, there's a lot of help out there. It's probably the one thing that you can really get a lot of help for. So you just steer that person to a social worker. Any agency will help. We're always there at the hospital to help as well. So I wanted to talk a little bit about child abuse. I'm sure you know a lot about it, what you've heard, what you've seen, what you've read. It still goes on a lot. I'm old, so in the olden days, they used to say that child abuse was if you hit your child or someone hit their child and you saw the bruises. But now they talk about abuse as being not only physical abuse, but of course sexual abuse, which they didn't talk about years ago as much. Emotional abuse, calling your child stupid, you're no good, you're the bad one. It can be a lot of things. And neglect. They talk about acts of omission and commission, meaning commission, beating your child, telling them they're stupid, all of the things that are pretty obvious. And the omission now is, if your child doesn't go to the dentist, schools. My children are adopted, and so I have been involved with the foster system for a long time. And how do I tell this story? My daughter's birth sibling, who's older than her, who we were supposed to adopt, but she got adopted by her counselor at the time. She has 2 little boys now. And the youngest one, the school was calling her up because of the kind of clothes he had on. He had on normal clothes, but they're very, very poor, so they had holes in them and things like this. And I was glad to hear that the school was paying attention, maybe to help her, but it's not her fault. But at least she was able to say, I don't have enough money for clothing for my children, and they were able to get her some help. But they're noticing these things now. If a child's coming in with obvious dental problems, you can now say to the parents, not only, tell them, well, your child needs dental care, do you need help paying for it? But there's also programs out there now that help. Medical care, same thing with that. If you saw a child coming into school, and I say the schools because they're the main, those in daycares, they're the main places where you see children away from their families, but coming in with a fever, coming in sick, mom's not keeping them home, that's child abuse, and maybe they just need some help. I always tell people in our maternity unit, we see a lot of moms that are poor, dirt poor, and I always tell them, there's help out there. And children and youth services, they don't believe me. See, in maternity, if you walk in and you introduce yourself as a social worker, you get the deer in the headlights look, because they automatically think you're going to take their kids, And I always giggle because there's a lot of reasons why I might walk in that room. I might be checking on my staff. I might be checking if the nurses are taking good care of her, but so I always giggle and make a joke and say, no, I'm not here for that reason. But I always tell them that there's help out there, that they're not alone. There's a lot of help out there. And I tell them that even though Children and Youth Services of any county is seen as people that are going to take my kids away, I tell them that they have a lot of help for them. And I tell them my story. My son was adopted. He was adopted at 2. He came with a lot of emotional problems. And as they got older, it was more than we could handle. As a social worker, I called Children's Services one day and I said, listen, I'm a social worker, I have a son, love him very much, he's adopted, has a lot of issues to work through, and he was causing big problems. I said, I always refer my patients to you for help, I would like some of that help. And they were amazing. They sent out what they call a wraparound worker, who was a young man in his 20s who accompanied my son to middle school and talked to him like a big brother in a sense. They sent out a family therapist that came and sat in our living room every week to help us to figure out how to help my son. They sent out numerous staff, and it was free. I was working, my husband was working, it was free. So I try to tell the moms in the hospital, there's a lot of help through Children's Services. It's not just an agency that takes your kids away. And if I can convince them of that, I can get them all kinds of things. So there is help out there, but people are afraid. People think they're going to, their children are going to be taken away, they're going to go to jail, that kind of thing. But like I said, there's a lot of help out there. And the last thing that they want to do is take a child away from their family, because there's not a lot of foster families out there. So if I can convince people of that, then we can really help them, but it's hard to convince them of that. And then, of course, victims of child abuse carry that with them through their whole lives. They have self-esteem problems, and they may be abusers themselves. It affects their schoolwork, it affects their job, as they're older, getting a job, going to school, finishing school. It affects their ability to form meaningful, healthy relationships. So, besides seeing a child who has bruises and welts and injuries, burns, fractures, that we sometimes see kids come in the ER with continual, dislocated shoulders and fractures, more than the norm, so we start to ask questions. But besides that, if you have children that are afraid to go home, they're running the streets, you're wondering why aren't they home, frightened of their parents, fearful of other adults, very quiet, lethargic, don't answer questions. You might have a child who's being abused. Every county has an 800 number that you can call anonymously to report child abuse or suspected child abuse. Someone will get out to the home within 24 hours and check that out. And if a child tells you, I like this part, if a child tells you that he or she is being abused, you should say your best friend's son comes to you and says, I'm being beaten. Of course, you don't want to believe that, it's your best friend. But avoid denying it and just stay calm and listen to them. Don't interrogate them. And reassure the child that it's not their fault. Because if you can get them talking to you, maybe you can find some answers for them. And then call your local child protective agency. And on weekends, there's an 800 number. They do respond. Again, and how can you help a child recover from physical abuse? Focus on successes. If you know of a child that's been through abuse, help them to look at the successes they've had in life, because their self-esteem is probably lower than low. Encourage them, tell them they've done a good job. Sense of humor is always good. It says, give the child age-appropriate chores and responsibilities. So show them that you trust them, you believe in them. Let the child know that he or she can talk to you and it's safe. Definitely set rules. Be consistent with punishment and never threaten violence. So that's just some ideas. It's a bigger problem than we think. It's out there a lot more than we even know. Do you remember remember that story in Ohio where the guy had the women in the basement for 10 years, and the neighbors didn't even know it? I'm not saying suspect your neighbors, I'm just saying don't be surprised, or if you see something that's not right, check it out. Check it out. And that brings me to elder abuse. That happens a lot with elder abuse. The things go on and we don't know it. We don't know about it. Our elders, especially the ones that are sick, that are home, that are being cared for by probably an exhausted caregiver, could be being abused. Maybe the caregiver needs help. And so that's something to look at. If you suspect that, it's not that they're a bad person, the caregiver, it's just that they shouldn't be doing it anymore. They can't do it anymore. They're too tired. With our growing elderly population, of course, we're going to see more and more of it. People don't have money for long-term care. They don't have money to pay someone to come in and take care of them. And even when they do, some of those people are caregivers, are abused. Some of those caregivers are abusers. Elder mistreatment. Abuse and neglect is defined as intentional actions that cause harm or create a serious risk of harm to a vulnerable elder by a caregiver or other person who stands in a trust relationship to the elder. This includes failure by a caregiver to satisfy basic needs. Maybe they're not feeding the person. We've had people come in the hospital, very, very sad. I guess that's the best thing I can tell you. Not being fed, underweight. We had a lady that went through surgery, and when they turned her over, when she was in surgery, they noticed healed burn marks on the back of her shoulder. We would have never seen them if she had not been in surgery. people being tied up at night so that they don't wander, given a bottle to urinate in. You know, it happens in today's society a lot. And then we see a lot of exploitation. Neighbors that may be good people and originally started to help the elderly person going to the store. I'll pick up something at the store, or she gives them the money. We had a gentleman that came in the hospital, and the neighbor next door was probably started out as a really good person, and then would go to the store, started cleaning, the elder was paying them, you know, and then, oh, can you go to the store? Here's my ATM card. And while you're there, get yourself some cookies, or get yourself a soda, and that escalated into, you know, spending all their money. That happens a lot. Family was living out of state, trusted this neighbor, thought everything was fine. Another instance, we had an elderly lady. She was from, I believe it was Norway, and she had come here with her husband years ago. Her husband passed away. She was quite elderly, wanted to move into assisted living. Called a realtor to sell her house. They sold her house, but after the house was sold, the realtor was still at the house every day. Showed up at the front door. She had no family here. Quite an intelligent lady. She knew something was wrong. Came in, brought hoagies, brought food. She'd get a bill for $500. Well, what's this bill for? Well, I took care of you. I cleaned your house. I bought you lunch. We had to get protective services involved, elder protective services involved. The police got involved. The realtor got fired from his job. And then she pressed charges, but we were able to get her right from the hospital into an assisted living so that she never went home where she might have to come across this gentleman. So just, you know, just be aware that it does happen a lot. It happens in all of our neighborhoods, and you probably never know unless you ask or you see something. Let's see what else. And then, of course, our elderly people with dementia and confusion, they're more at risk for obvious reasons. And there's a lot of them that still live at home and have to depend on people to come in and care for them. There are services out there. In Chester County, there's a long waiting list for services. To go to a nursing home, you have to either be able to pay for it privately or be on Medicaid. And in order to get into a nursing home that will accept nursing home Medicaid for you, you have to almost offer them something like, oh, I have $30,000 in the bank, I'll pay you until that money is down to nothing, and then you keep me here under Medicaid. So you almost have to make deals with them because they're trying to make money too. And then a lot of these elderly people that were young, well, they're elderly now, and I'm getting to that point, you know, they saved all their lives, and they may have $20,000 in the bank, and that's nothing. But they've saved all their lives for their retirement, and they just don't have enough to live on, so it's a vicious cycle. So anyway, if you have, or you know of an elderly person that's at risk that needs help, you can call Protective Services. It's called Adult Protective Services. Every county has one. They're affiliated with the Office of Aging in the same county. They will come out within 24 hours, and they will get involved, very much so. I've seen them in action, particularly in Montgomery County, and they do a fabulous, fabulous job. So when in doubt, make a call. If you're wrong, you're wrong. But if you're right, that's a good thing you made that call. The calls are anonymous. They're not allowed to tell anybody who called. I won't tell you that sometimes people figure it out, so, but you have to be brave and call because you're concerned about the person. So, and that's pretty much the main points that I have. Does anybody have any questions? I do want to say that with elderly people, if the caregiver of that person who's the alleged abuser is burned out, there are also services for that person. There's caregiver support groups, counseling, individual counseling, there's all kinds of programs. The hospital has a caregiver support group program. The senior center has a caregiver support group program. A lot of places do. And there's tons of books on it, you know, for self-help. I guess that's what they call it, self-help. So, yes. Anybody have anything to say? say? Any questions, any concerns, any ideas? Okay. Well, thank you very much for bearing with me and listening. I'm honored to come out, and if I can do anything for anybody, I'm up at the hospital, Mary Beth. All you have to do is call and ask for Mary Beth or the social worker, and you'll get me. Thank you very much.